The last part of my opening remarks, I wanted to talk about dialectical materialism. First question, what is dialectical materialism? Very important question, right? You would think everyone would know what dialectical materialism is, right? Because everyone in America knows that Karl Marx didn't work. Communism failed. Everyone's an expert on Marxism. But barely anyone knows about dialectical materialism. Mill and Locke. And long before Karl Marx was a communist, Karl Marx was a dialectical materialist. He was that before he was a communist. Did you know that? Before he was a communist, he was a dialectical materialist. He started out in philosophy, and then he moved into politics, and then he moved into economics. Karl Marx was a dialectical materialist. And this is the basis of Marxist philosophy. And dialectical materialism is this, right? I've spelled it out for people before. I guess I have to write it out. And, you know, I am not the first person to say this, right? I mean, this is in, I think, Dialectics of Nature by Friedrich Engels. Trotsky quotes it in Marxism in Our Time. You know, I am not the first person to talk this way. This is a very common expression of dialectical materialism, but I'm writing it on this pad of paper, right? And no, it has nothing to do with Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand said her shit later. This was said long before Ayn Rand. This was in, this is Friedrich Engels. This is Marx. This is the basis of the Marxist philosophy. A does not equal A, or A is not A. Right? That is the basis of the Marxist philosophy. And basically what it is that this first A can never be the same as this second A. No matter how close I drew it, no matter how similar they were, there are no two things in the universe that are exactly alike. And the universe is constantly in a state of change. The world is not static. The universe is constantly in flux, constantly in motion, constantly changing. You know, our body is made up of cells. Those cells are made up of molecules. Those molecules are made up of atoms. And those atoms are, you know, energy, basically. They're protons and neutrons. They're energy, and they're energy. The universe is nothing but change, right? This is dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism argues that all that exists is matter, right? There was a debate in philosophy between what they called idealism and materialism. Idealism is the belief that the mind creates reality. Classical idealism is the belief that God, in his mind, said, let there be light and let there be an earth, and that everything came into existence as a reflection of the thoughts of God. Or there's other forms of idealism, like The Secret, right? Where people sit there and go, money, 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 and they think money will happen, that thinking makes it so, that thought creates reality, that material is a reflection of thought. I think, therefore I am, was said by Descartes. Well, Marxists and materialists say, no, I am, therefore I think. That thought is inseparable from matter that thinks. Friedrich Engels said that, you know, that there is this thing called a brain. You have this material thing called a brain, and the brain thinks, and that thought is a material process because you have a material thing called a brain. Thought is inseparable from matter that thinks. Talk to ye, Caleb. Okay, talk to ye too, right? Have you ever believed ideology besides ML? And that is the materialism idealism debate. And Marx, he believed in materialism, but he had a special understanding of materialism because it was dialectical materialism. And that came from Hegel. Hegel had the concept of the dialectic, that the world is constantly in motion and that it is conflict between different forces that drives forward the contradiction. That it is conflict between different forces that drives forward the contradiction, right? That first you have a thesis, then you have an antithesis, they clash, and you get a synthesis. The synthesis becomes the new thesis, a new antithesis, and they clash, you get a new synthesis, and that this is the process. Oh, it's Kanye. Got it. See, I didn't get it. Right? Talk to Kanye, Caleb. Okay, I'll write that down. That's a good question. We'll talk about Kanye. That is the process of change, is through conflict. There are materials, but this matter is constantly in a state of motion, and it's constantly clashing, and there's constantly conflict, dialectic, and this conflict drives forward history. They talk about, you know, heat, right? If we get to a state of absolute zero, there's no motion. But absolute zero exists almost nowhere in the universe. Everywhere in the universe, there's heat because there is conflict. There are atoms, and molecules banging into each other. There's motion, there's energy, and that energy is heat. And that the universe is based on conflict, things that cannot coincide with each other, clashing into each other, creating energy, driving forward history. That is dialectical materialism. That is the basis of Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism. And I have admitted that I am not a pure dialectical materialist. I'm not. And it's funny because I used to think I stopped being a dialectical materialist when I started believing in God again around 2015. But I realized I was never a true dialectical materialist. I do believe that change comes largely through struggle. I do believe that history is driven forward by class struggle and class contradictions, and that, contending social forces and economic forces. I accept a lot of it. In a lot of ways, I'm a historical and dialectical materialist, but I'm not completely true to it because I've always believed in the power of ideas. And I don't necessarily think that ideas always reflect the underlying economic base. And I do believe in God and a higher spiritual power. And I'm not sure that the only reason human beings think is because we have this material thing called a brain. I do think that there is something in human beings that is separate from all other animals. We do have the spark of creativity. We do have the ability to make nature serve us, as Frederick Engels observed. And that's not just some natural result of the material world. I do believe human beings have a spiritual capacity. And I do believe that we can become connected to a higher power. And I do believe that ideas and truth and emotions are not simply material things. So I'm not a strict dialectical materialist. I'm not. I'm not a strict dialectical materialist. I never really have been. And what's interesting is that it was never demanded of me that I become one. The communist groups I was around never really made too much of a big deal out of this. One of the communist groups I was in really insisted you be an atheist. But I was only around them briefly. And then the other communist groups didn't really care about this. But this is the foundation. The foundation of the Marxist philosophy is dialectical materialism. And I realize, and I said, one of my most popular videos is called "What is Dialectical Materialism? A Quick 6-Minute Answer." It's a very popular video, on my YouTube channel, like 40,000 some views, very popular. It's one of my most popular videos where I gave an answer and explained it. And in that video, I admitted I'm not actually a full-on dialectical materialist. But today I was thinking about this, right? Because I've been reading, a lot of people that are critical. The LaRouche movement, the followers of Lyndon LaRouche, they vehemently reject dialectical materialism. They believe in the power of ideas, right? And that they will tell you this. I'm not tattling on them. They reject dialectical materialism. They do believe in the power of ideas. They're critical of Marxist materialism. And that's to their credit. And I don't speak for them. I'm not part of their organization. They're friendly with me, but they reject dialectical materialism. There's other organizations that reject dialectical materialism. I was reading critiques of dialectical materialism. And the most of the critiques made of dialectical materialism, this is interesting to me. Most of the critiques made of dialectical materialism argue that this notion that the universe is defined by conflict is wrong. And they point to many different things as examples of this. One example is the solar system. They point to the solar system and they say, look, you got the sun in the center, you got the planets revolving around it. It's not a conflict, it's oneness, it's unity. But a dialectical materialist looks at it and they say, no, there's conflict beneath the surface. The sun and its gravity is pulling on them, and they're being pulled by other forces in the universe, and that clash creates the energy that makes them keep going around the sun, and it's all about conflict. And A non-dialectician looks at it and says, no, it's the gravity makes everything fit into place. And it's that the sun is here and they're here and they know their perfect place. And there's this perfect alignment, and it's not conflict, it's order. It's not chaos and clashing, it's order. And I look at the solar system and I think they're both right. It's both. There is gravity, there is conflict, and there's also order. It's both. And then another great example. This is an interesting one. This is a little R-rated. So if you're somebody who doesn't like, graphic things, I'll try not to be explicit here, but it's an example that must be given. Sex. The Sex Act, right? Those who are opponents of dialectical materialism will say, look, the ultimate act of creation is sex. When two human beings have sex with each other. And if you look at it, sex is not an act of conflict. It's two people loving each other, trusting each other, getting into an intimate moment with each other, and being intimate in that way. And when sex is a conflict, that's a very ugly thing called rape, right? And no one thinks rape is good, but sex, the way it's supposed to be, sex within the context of a relationship that in producing a child, etc., is not an act of conflict. But the dialectical materialist looks at it and says, don't want to get too explicit here, but actually it is. The male body parts and the female body parts are in contradiction with one another, and they start clashing with each other. And if there's not a lot of conflict, and if they're not pushing against each other and combating and clashing with each other, it doesn't work. If you know anything about how sex is done, it is very much a conflict. It is very much a confrontation. And the non-dialectical materialist looks at it and it says, okay, yeah, in physical nature, there is a confrontational aspect to sex, but the nature of the act is to bring two people together. The nature of the act is people expressing intimacy with each other. I mean, this is, it's not that. And the more you think about the sex act, it's both. It's both. There is a conflicting attitude about it. There is a confrontation involved. There's also a deeply intimate oneness and unity involved. And that the universe is defined by both unity and conflict, unity and struggle. And you can't say that the nature of the universe is purely struggle. Struggle is a big part. Conflict, chaos, instability, confrontation is a big part of the universe. But oneness and unity and cohesion is another part of the universe. And that these are just two conflicting aspects of reality. And that, yes, I would agree. I have gotten to the point that I agree. Is Star Trek democratic, meritocratic, or socialist? I am at the point where I would agree that the root of some of the ugliest problems that we have had in our movement is the dialectic. And I've said this for a while, that the dialectical approach, the belief that change always comes through struggle, the change always comes through conflict, is the source of the weakness of our movement. The Cultural Revolution in China, that was a whole society. It is right to rebel. Kids, rise up against your teachers and parents. Tear down everything. Burn it down, tear it down. And it was a nightmare. China remembers the Cultural Revolution as a dark period in their history. And the Great Terror of 1937, when Yezhov-Shina, when everyone in the Soviet Union, they thought there were Nazi spies everywhere. People were turning in their neighbors. People were turning in their friends. That was a dark period in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was doing amazing things economically, but that moment where everyone was punishing everyone else, everyone was turning in, that was a dark period. Right after the Cuban Revolution, when the Cuban Communist Party came to power, there were a lot of executions. They took out a lot of people from the old government, from the Batista government, and put them to the firing squad. That wasn't a good thing. A lot of them were war criminals. A lot of them had been very corrupt, but it wasn't, dragging a bunch of people out and shooting them. You talk about the French Revolution. It was great to overturn feudalism in France, but listen to the French national anthem, the lyrics, let the impure blood water our field. This is this belief that conflict and confrontation is the basis of all the universe and all social change, and that what we are about is exacerbating and intensifying the contradiction. This is not a good way to look at the world. And I have lived that way. And from my own lived experience, I spent my 20s thinking this way. And I burned out on it after a while. You can't be full of hate all the time. You can't be full of anger all the time. I'm working on a video project. It'll probably be a while before it comes out, where I kind of go into, I talk about not details about my personal life, but rather how my views have changed, right? And that Trotsky, the reason that Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was repudiated was the Soviet people didn't want to have permanent revolution. They didn't want to storm into Europe and have a permanent civil war. They wanted to have socialism in one country. And what people liked about the Soviet Union, what Anna Louise Strong writes about in her work, and what Edgar Snow writes about in his books on China, it's not that they had conflict and everyone was tearing it down and burning it down. It's the opposite. It's that they had unity. There may have been a revolution to bring the communists to power, but they didn't come to power in order to create chaos. They came to power in order to bring a level of unity. And that's when I talk about three forms of socialism. When the socialism that actually emerged from the Bolshevik Revolution and into the 20th century, now into the 21st century, it's not that dialectical philosophy. It's not that, change comes through conflict, rise up, tear it down. And that largely this was, that the French Revolution, people talk about the French Revolution, was a mass outpouring of rage and violence and sex. That it was the fact that feudal society, based on this belief that it was a belief in oneness, right? There's one God. He leads. He gives instructions to the Pope. The Pope gives divine right to the kings. Everyone has their place. Feudal society was based on this belief in pure oneness. And it was very repressive, and people were holding in their anger. People were holding in their sex drive all the time. There was a lot of injustice. And the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, came along and they said, now, if we want to come to power, all we have to do is give people permission to unleash their rage, unleash their sexual aggression, and we can create a social explosion so big, we can tear down feudalism. And it worked. There's a reason the Marquis de Sade was one of the main voices of the French Revolution, the Marquis de Sade. Why? The Marquis de Sade, from whom the term sadism is derived, the Marquis de Sade was a pornographer who was also an agitator, an atheist, and an agitator of the French Revolution. And he actually argued that having naked women on display, was the best propaganda for the French Revolution, because it got people sexually aroused. And that in order to overthrow feudalism in France and in other places, the bourgeoisie went around and gave people permission to unleash their rage, their desire for violence, as well as their sexual desires. And it worked. And leftism became synonymous with that. Leftism was about rebellion. Leftism was about tear it down. Leftism was about sexual freedom. Leftism was about barricades and guillotines and violence. And this is the problem that our movement has had. And if you look at China today, that's not what communism is about. And starting with what Stalin did with the 5-year plans, and then later what Mao did, and Deng Xiaoping, and socialism nowadays is actually more about achieving oneness than about instability. But that drive to rebel, to unleash people's sexual impulses, to unleash people's rage, their desire for violence, that's coming from Western capitalism now. And this is a big point I've made in City Builders and Vandals and in my book on Kamala Harris and elsewhere. The drive for instability and violence, the dialectical worldview, which is all about burn it down, tear it down, destroy it, that's coming from Western capitalism now. Western capitalism is promoting that. And it's the socialist world that is saying, let's hold our society together. Let's keep people unified. Let's have economic growth. Let's not just go into this entropy caused by unlimited rage and violence. And so I look at this and I realize that I'm not a true dialectical materialist. I never was one. I thought I was, but I didn't really understand it. And starting in 2015, I realized, okay, I believe in God, but I never really was one. I did believe in the power of ideas. And starting around 2015, I was just so sick of the confrontation. I was just so sick of the burn it down, tear it down, that my worldview started changing. And I also realized, though, that there's a huge amount of truth in dialectical materialism. Conflict, contending social forces, that is a driver of history. You can't deny that there's a huge amount of truth in dialectical and historical materialism. However, it's not the only truth. You look at the Sex Act, you look at the solar system, dialectical materialism is half right. It's not completely right. Not completely right. That makes me realize that one of the problems that our movement has also faced is this attempt to impose a narrative that has the answer for everything. The universe does have many sides. The universe does indeed have many sides. There are different sides of reality. There is only one objective reality. Reality is not in the eye of the beholder. However, reality has different aspects to it. And if you build a movement on the notion that dialectical materialism, this is the one correct way of understanding the world, or as was previously done in feudal society and is now done by those with an anti-dialectical view, and you say, no, idealism is the one. If you do that, people are going to reject it, because there's always going to be a part of people, and this is very dialectical, that's going to say, yeah, but what about? If you try to tell people that no, dialectical materialism is the one correct way of understanding the universe, there's going to be people saying, yeah, but what about all the things I just raised? I've had people, when I say A does not equal A, I've had people who are chemists, and they said to me, well, Caleb, I know what you're saying about there are slight differences, but if A does not equal A, chemical formulas don't work. That's a fair point. Right? If you're mixing two elements, one element has always got to be that element, or else you wouldn't be able to have a chemical formula. Right? I mean, that's true. Now, it may be that no item and no piece of substance is exactly like any other, but if you have a chemical formula and you need this much gold and this much silver, it's either gold or silver or it's not. That's a fair point as well. So if you try to say that you have a philosophy that defines all of reality, you're almost doomed to failure, because you're trying to impose a set of answers onto the world that is never going to be satisfactory. And that's always going to be a problem. People are going to push back against that because they're smart. Human beings are creative creatures. They are intelligent. If you try to impose an answer onto all of reality and say you have a worldview that defines all of reality and impose it, it's going to bounce back in your face. People are going to find some hole in it. They're going to reject it. You know, if you demand everyone agree with you, right? If we tried to be, like a vanguard party formation in the CPI, and we said we want everyone in the organization to have the exact same position as us on everything, we wouldn't have much of an organization. It used to be you were able to do that kind of thing. I was in the Workers' World Party, and the Workers' World Party, they didn't just want you to agree with them about Palestine. They didn't just want you to agree with them about North Korea. They wanted you to agree with them about every historical event ever, about Hungary in 1956, about Czechoslovakia in 1968, about, peasant, and that is the classical ML way of doing things, is right. The party has a line on the steel workers strike of 1919, and you better agree with it, right? And if you disagree, we struggle it out, right? Combat liberalism, we just struggle it out if you disagree. Well, people aren't going to agree. People are going to disagree, and you have to learn to work with people you disagree with. And this is what our enemies have taken advantage of. Our enemies, they push the opposite. Marxism says it has this totalist answer, dialectical materialism that explains everything. Well, our enemies say, well, actually, there's nothing that can explain everything. There is no truth. There's no point in life. There's no reason to be. Everything's just a matter of opinion. It's all hopeless. Ideology is a big totalitarian scam. And they bring the opposite message. They say there is no way to understand the world. There is no historical progress. There is no right and wrong. There is no moral purpose. And they just say there's nothing. And what they have done, more or less, is they picked up a weakness in our movement and they adjusted, right? It used to be that there was a totalistic ideology in the West called Christianity and American democracy in the true way. And that was the one totalist answer. And then there was communism, which was the alternative totalist answer. But then they realized, well, there is no totalist answer. And so if we just start getting everyone to think there is no truth, there is no purpose, everything will just fall apart. It was some brilliant jujitsu, using your enemy's strength against them. They said the Marxists are so good. They have this well thought out dialectical materialist ideology. So what we'll do is, instead of saying, well, we have this correct ideology, this old ideology, instead, we're just going to say there is no ideology. There is no truth. And it worked. It's been working. And now people need ideology. However, in order for people to accept ideology in our age, the ideology presented to them must be non-totalistic. And that's what we have to realize. If we are going to be successful in pushing ideology in our modern world, the ideology that we push must be non-totalistic. We must be willing to admit we don't know everything. We must be able to tolerate different interpretations. We must be willing to say there are different ways of understanding different events. That we can have an ideological framework with which we view the world, that there is struggle and conflict, that there's capitalists and workers, there's socialism and capitalism, there's the economic base and the superstructure. We can recognize all of that, but we can also say, but this ain't everything. This doesn't explain everything. It wasn't in Che Guevara's material interest to give up his life of wealth and luxury and go into the mountains to fight for the peasantry. It wasn't in his interest, but he did it.